In a good quality stainless steel pot, I've got about 1.5 gallons of water here that I'm heating up so that I can steep the grains. What we're going to make here today is a Citra Pale Ale, and I'm going to tweak it just a little bit. But I've got about 5 pounds of grain. That's a little bit more than you normally use for a partial mash. Usually a partial mash you're doing about 2 pounds of grain and then adding about 6 pounds of liquid malt. This one here, I'm going to start off with a 5 pounds of grain that I'm going to, normally I would use a sock hop, but because there's so much, I'm going to use a silk bag. And then I've got just under 4 pounds of liquid malt. For brewing, for boiling the wort, I'm going to use 2 ounces of hops. I always prefer using a liquid yeast over a dry yeast. That's just my own preference. And then how I'm going to tweak this is I'm going to add some grapefruit puree, and I'm going to add 2 ounces of leaf hops for dry hopping at the end during the fermentation. So we'll get started by putting the grains into the bag, putting the bag into the water. I have a thermometer here. I want to bring the grains up to about 150 degrees and then let it set. Let it steep for a half hour, 45 minutes. So we'll get started here. Okay, I just added the grains to the water. I'm trying to bring it up to temperature. So I got my thermometer there. I've got a good brewing spoon. And we'll bring this water up to temperature so that we can steep the grains. As you can see, I've brought the grains up to 150 degrees Fahrenheit. Give it a nice little stir. I got a nice coverage on the grains. I've just pulled it off the burner. Now I'm going to put the lid on it and just let it set for about an hour and really soak it and steep all of the sugars out of that grain, all the flavors. And we'll see you in a little bit. An hour has passed. The grains have been steeping. Now it's time to pull them out and strain them. Normally I would use a strainer like this, but since I have such a large amount of grains, I'm going to use a strainer like this. And we will go ahead and pull the grains out, let them drain into the wort, and rinse them off a little bit, adding more water to the boil. So we have the grains in the strainer sitting above the wort. We're just going to pour in some nice, rinse these off. Get as much of the sugar as we can off of these grains, and then we will remove it and bring the boil back up. Now that we're bringing water up to temperature, we're going to go ahead and add the liquid malt. We're going to go ahead and pour that in and bring that up to boil. And then we'll have our wort. For sanitizing, I like to use a tablespoon of iodine down in my carboy. And then I will throw in my blow-off tube. gasket for my lid. And then I will fill it up with water and let the whole thing set for about an hour, for the last hour of the boil. And that way it will sanitize all of my glassware, my fermentation product, before we pour the wort down inside. I have divided up my hops so that I can start timing my beer and the time of my hop. My wort is up to boil, so I'm going to add the first amount of hops to the boil. And there we go, and now we're going to start timing it. 1 hour boil time. We're halfway through our boil, and it's time to throw in the next set of hops. Now this is an area where you want to time your boil so that you get the correct amount of hop bitterness agents from the hops. The other hops that I put in there a half hour ago are still floating in there. So we're halfway through our boil. Everything's looking good. This is one of my favorite parts of boiling beer. I just love the smell of the hops and the malt and everything just permeating throughout the house. So we're going to let this boil, and like I say, this is the area where you want to time it. Our next time will be another 15 minutes down for the last 15 minutes of the boil. With that said, I did have one experience. I'm going to go ahead and tell you this story. I was right at the end of my boil, getting ready to sparge it over into the carboy, when I received a phone call that my wife with kids had just been involved in an accident. They happened to be driving my truck at the time. So I just turned the stove off, put the lid on the boil, and didn't get back to it for several hours. At that point I was debating, should I go ahead and throw it all out because the thing had been sitting on the stove for half a day, or should I just go ahead and pull the hops out, rack it over, and see what happens? Well, we decided to just see what happens. We ended up calling that beer the accidental beer because of that. All the timetables were shot, and it turned out to be a pretty good beer. We enjoyed that one. So you never know. I mean, it is important to time your hops and time your boil, but sometimes stuff happens. We're at the last 15 minutes of the boil. It's time to add the last stage of the hops. And I'm going to add a wort lock tablet for the last 15 minutes. I used to use Irish moss. Either one of them were good. They act as a clarifier. So we'll move on over here. Drop the pellet in. Drop the third stage of hop. And we're down to the last 15 minutes. Alright, we're getting ready to stop our boil and sparge the wort over into our carboy. Now I like to use a big mouth glass carboy. I prefer glass over plastic. And this is a 6.5 gallon carboy. That also leaves me room when I'm making a 5-gallon keg, a 5-gallon batch. That leaves me room for a little bit of the fermentation. So what I've added here is about 1.5 gallons of ice water. That's important to cool down the wort. It also helps if you pour the hot wort into a glass carboy, the glass will break. Trust me, I know that for a fact. So I've got 1.5 gallons of ice water here. I'm going to go ahead and add my grapefruit puree. At this point, there are several stages you could add this. I'm going to add this right at this point. The other thing that I'm going to add is I've got 1 ounce of hop leaves for dry hopping. I'm going to add this also to the batch. And then we're going to go ahead and cool down our wort and move from there. Okay, I just pulled my hop socks out of the wort. I pulled it off of the burner. Now we're going to add some cold refrigerated water, and we're going to start to cool this down as quickly as we can. To cool my wort down, I use ice water and ice. I've got to get it up to 5 gallons anyway for my batch. I've boiled off 2 gallons of water, so we're going to cool this down. Now I don't have a chiller. A lot of guys have chillers. The more experienced guys do have chillers. But like I said from the beginning, I'm showing you how to economically make a good batch of beer. So we're going to cool this down. Melt off all this ice, add a little bit more water, and then we're going to sparge it. Alright, we've added the cold water and the ice to the wort. We've cooled it down. We've got ice water in the carboy, and we're going to just go ahead and dump this over, sparge the mix. Now we're going to top that off with a little bit more water. Right about there will do. We're going to aerate this just a little bit. Put on the lid. And install an airlock. And then we're going to transport it down in to my workstation where I'm going to let it ferment. I'm going to let it cool down a little bit. This is really cool as it is right now. We're going to let this cool down a little bit more. And then we're going to add the yeast in about an hour or 2. So I'm going to transport this downstairs. Now it's time to go ahead and yeast the beer. By the way, this one next to it is one that I made last week. It's a dry stout, and we racked it over for the secondary to let it clear. As you can tell, it's looking pretty good. This one here, we're going to have quite a bit of activity once we pour in the yeast. So let's go ahead and do that now. Now we'll go ahead and put the lid back on. Make sure we get a good seal on that. And we're going to go ahead and hook up the blow-off tube, because I'm sure this one's going to show a lot of activity once the yeast becomes active. So we're going to take off the airlock. Connect up good seal on that. Okay, we got the airlock hooked up to blow-off tube. Comes down into a water trap, so that we have a good airlock on it. And we're going to let this one have at it. We'll come back and film this as the yeast is forming. You'll see quite a bit of head build up on here. You'll see quite a bit of activity down in here. 24 hours since I added the yeast. As you can see, this is percolating pretty good here. I knew I would need the blow-off tube, with adding the grapefruit puree. So the blow-off tube is doing pretty good. We're getting a good fermentation out here. Seeing quite a bit of activity inside the keg. The dry hops inside. We'll check back a little bit later. It's been a week since I brewed this, and as you can see, it has settled down quite a bit. It's become quite clear. I've got my sediment down below, my dry hop up on top. There's some residue left over from the blow-off, the fermentation. You can double check this with a hydrometer, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's the proper way to check, but there hasn't been any activity here in at least 3 days, maybe more. So I'm about ready to rack this over into my secondary ferment carboy. Now I'll just say a word about cleaning up my carboys. After scrubbing out a carboy, I will usually let it soak with a little bit of powdered brewery wash. This removes any beer stone that you might have left over, any residue that you might have left over in your carboy. This eliminates problems down the road of having a yeast infection. I have had those in the past before I actually started using the powdered brewery wash. The thing to remember with this is when you use just a spoonful of that in the carboy and let it soak for 24 hours, make sure that you rinse it out 2 or 3 times before you put it away or before your next use. I also like to sanitize with the iodine, and again I will put basically about a cap full of iodine into a carboy, fill it up, and let that set for probably an hour or 2 before I will use the new carboy. And you don't have to rinse off once you use the iodine. I always give it just a quick little rinse to make sure everything is covered, and then I'm ready to use my secondary. So I'm going to set up my siphon tube, and we're going to rack this over for my second stage fermentation or aging. Now I have my siphon tube set up, and I'm drawing the beer out of the fermentation keg, and we're racking it over into the secondary keg. It's looking really good. Got a little bit of sediment off of the bottom, which I always get with the siphon tube. That's a little bit of this. That's another reason why I like to use the secondary fermentation keg, to eliminate a lot of this residue. When doing this, I always like to draw a little sample out and test my beer. I'm getting a good, clear beer out of this. It's looking pretty good. It has a nice taste to it. And I think we're up and running. I'm going to add a little bit of extra hops on the dry hopping. On this stage, you don't have to do that, but I just want a little bit more of a flower when you raise this glass to your nose. I've just completed racking my beer over. As you can see, there's quite a bit of sediment built down in the bottom here. The dry hops on top. And we've racked that over. And this time I'm going to use a dry hopping on the second stage. Normally I would use pellets and a sock hop to eliminate any residue that I would have down in the beer. But this time I decided to get as much of a bouquet or a flower when you raise the glass to your nose. And so I used a leaf hop for this. And I don't know if you can see this, but because it is racked over and because we do have the hops in there, I'm getting just a little bit of amount of activity going on here. We will let this set for about a week before we keg it. I use kegs instead of bottles, and with the dry hops it is going to be a little bit messier. I have to be a little more careful as I'm racking it over, but I'm going to get a better tasting beer by dry hopping it using the leaf hops. See you in about a week. It's been 2 weeks since I brewed this one. This is my grapefruit IPA. We racked it over into a secondary carboy. We added some more dry hops to it. As you can see, this is really clear. You can see all the way through this beer. This is very nice colored. We're putting it over into the keg. Once the keg is full, this is a Cornelius keg or a soda keg. Once this is full, then we're going to hook up the gas to it and fill the tank and charge it, and we will let it set for another week with the carbonation powered up to it. I poured a little sample. This is called Research and Development. You can see this is a very beautiful looking beer. It's got a very large bouquet to it because of the dry hopping we did to it. And we're going to go ahead and let this drain over, and then we'll get back to the charging in just a minute. Alright, we've finished putting all of the beer into the keg. I've hooked it up to the CO2. So we're letting this carbonate. I'll let this set a little bit. While this is carbonating, you want to bleed off any air that the gas will push up to the top, because as we all know, air hurts your beer. That's why we have the airlocks on the fermentation and throughout the entire process. And so we're just bleeding off any excess air from the keg. We'll do that a few more times as the carbonation sets into this. Then we will unhook it, set it aside, and let it age under the carbonation. And we will put it over into the kegerator, be ready to drink in about another week, maybe 2.